So if you've been printing and you want to refill the clay container, with the machine switched off, you can pull down, unscrew the base here, pull down, and then that wire clicks in on this bracket underneath here. You can unclip the electrics, make sure that the air pressure is right off, unclip the air hose, and you can unclip the clay container, and we're ready to refill. So it's not uncommon for the end caps to get quite stiff on these clay containers. Normally the end where the kind of air is, that it comes off kind of this grip. But the other end where the clay's been coming out often is kind of really stiff. I'm afraid I do take it to it with a hammer. You can see I'm getting a little bent here, but I'll give it a couple little taps, kind of to get it going, and then often I can do it by hand. But I have also made this thing, this plank of wood with a hole made through it, so it goes over there, and then obviously the screws just sit on the two little hands either side here. And that kind of can give me a grip to then undo it as well. So then obviously your clay can be dug out of there, but what I do as well is to just with a piece of wood, have it inside there, and then I can actually help get the clay out like that. Sometimes under pressure. There we go. There's a plunger inside. So before refilling the container, I do tend to keep this quite well lubricated. So I've run out of silicone spray, but normally I would give it a spray of silicone spray, and then with a cloth kind of rub around just to make sure that the inside is kind of well lubricated. And then I also tend to keep these rubbers of the plunger well lubricated. My clay, I tend to kind of mix it just using the tips of my fingers and go round and go from one pile to the other, kind of back and forth. So now this probably isn't quite enough to fill that, but for demonstration will be alright. Then also I've got this, what I call a drop spike, for kind of measuring the consistency of the clay. So a piece of reinforcing rod that's been ground to a bit of an angle of 60 degrees, that gives us a constant, and it's got a 10 centimeter marker on there. This is then 20 centimeters. So if you lift it, you're going to be dropping a 200 gram spike 10 centimeters in the clay. And if we do that constantly, I give it a tour and take it out, and then I can see how far it went down. I'm looking for a kind of a depth of about 3 to 3.5 centimeters. Seems to be a kind of consistency of clay that I like working to. Now, I've got to say, all of this is how I do it. There'll be as many ways as there are people who work with these machines. But anyway, this is what works for me, and I hope it's useful. So to fill up here, I tend to just begin with literally plunge it into the clay. Draw that, and then after that I can just keep filling. And obviously as I whack this on, I make sure that I'm not getting any air bubbles. I mean, I think the screw is sort of forgiving that if any air bubbles do go down the pipe, the screw does tend to take them out. I tend not to get air bubbles coming out of my nozzle. But then if I'm careful when I'm filling here, I probably wouldn't anyway. Maybe obviously I would have kind of put all that inside, scrape off the worst of this, and then put our plunger in and work that in. Now when you are putting the plunger in, just be careful that you have pushed it far enough that this little nut here will clear that. So there's nothing worse than tightening this down and then finding, oh, it seems really nice and tight, but in actual fact the nut is just pressing on the plunger. And then when you pressurize the whole thing, obviously it leaks with air. So now this is the air going to go on here. So I keep all the threads as clean as possible, otherwise you get this problem of kind of undoing these things. A toothbrush is quite useful to get into the threads here and clean them. Okay, so then it's there, and there's nothing worse than having air leaking out of the end here. Then your compressor keeps coming on. So I'm afraid that this is Vaseline. I just tend to run a bit of Vaseline around there. Your silica spray could do the same. Just spray inside there. There's a rubber seal. And this just I find needs to be finger tight. I tend not to get leakages, but I am cautious. So that's finger tight. Then normally, obviously, I would have filled this right up so that there would be the clay would be flush on the end here, and then this end plate is ready to go in. At this end, I make sure it's there's a bit of clay on it, but I just tend to put it in. If I've been printing and I'm doing a refill, I'll always put a little bit of kind of bulge of clay on there, making sure that that presses onto the clay that's inside to make sure I'm not getting an air bubble. And again, this I just do finger tight, and we have a container of clay ready to go again. Right, so getting printing, it's always in reverse. Let me hang this on first. Okay, and then the electrics gets clipped on as well. You need to watch out that as this goes up and down, this length gets longer, it rises up, and this can get caught under here. So you've just got to watch out that this is always free, kind of when you start printing and it's up and going up and down. And obviously your air pipe needs to go into the press connector there. And then this can be screwed back onto here. Okay, I'll just keep these little guys free from the motor, so they're kind of pointing away from the motor, not onto the motor. Right, I think we're kind of ready to go. So I can now turn up the pressure. So I'm now pressurizing the air container. And I tend to work at about 4 bar of pressure. Obviously my little compressor down there is 8 bar, and it then clicks in at 6 bar. So you don't want to be going kind of higher than 6 bar, otherwise you'll kind of the pressure, as I said, only clicks in at 6 bar. It'll then go back to 8 bar, but you can, between 6 and 8, you could be kind of losing pressure or not be constant at least. So anyway, you know, the clay consistency that I'm using, 4 bar is absolutely fine. So that's pressurized there, right? So I can now switch on the machine, power switch around the back, controller at the top, press in once, first thing I do is to extrude some material. Okay, so I want to extrude a bit of material just to kind of get it all sorted out. So in the home position, press in once, turn down to extrude material and extrude material. Now, I tend to do it at first without a nozzle on, just to make sure that if, you know, kind of having not used my machine for a while, this clay is quite stiff. It can then ease out quite easily. So it's an anti-clockwise thing that ups the numbers. Right, so I've put the nozzle back on, so I want to extrude clay again. In one, down to extrude material, and then turn it anti-clockwise. So here you can see the selection of nozzles. I'm busy using a 2mm nozzle at the moment. I've actually taken I think 6mm nozzle and put a little pipe inside it to come down to a 3mm nozzle, because I rather like a 3mm, and then I think it's the 5, and then whatever the big one is, not quite sure, never used that, but as your nozzle gets bigger, you're going to get through a lot more clay. Returning to the controller, I press in, and a second time and a third time, and that returns me to the main menu. So going through the menus, disable steppers I tend not to use. Auto home, obviously if you switch it on somewhere. Load material I don't use, as you can see I've just sort of moved it when it was switched off. And then move axis, I don't use that. Modify Z obviously I do use, so that's for different heights. So we press into that, and obviously there's a number here. And what I've done is I've kept a little list, it's basically millimeters. So if I'm printing on the floor, I set that number to 1160. If I'm working on the table, so the table obviously so for the table there are brackets that get attached to each vertical, and there's the table at the back there. I found it was a little bit high for what I want, you know, kind of an in-between level. So in fact, as you can see, I've got this contraption that is a bucket that is kind of held onto a board, and then you know, it's a bit lower than the table would be, but it's not right down on the floor. So you can see for bucket level I'm 786, and that's where I am at the moment. And then the table that they supply 483. So one, you know, kind of turns it to whichever selection you want. And this is, it'll go in points of a millimeter, so you can kind of really get a fine Z height moving up and down. Obviously, when you do set it going, there's the emergency switch off here, because you don't want to crash a nozzle down into, you know, into the floor or into the table or something, if you happen to get your numbers right. So, getting out of that, I'm back in my home menu now, so I'm working on the bucket. Right, so now I'm ready to print, so pressing once, down to print from SD card. Obviously the SD card is just on the left here. And select the file. Yeah. There's just files on the SD card. I want this cylinder here. Press enter, and away it goes. And then this is what you need to watch out for, is for this line getting caught underneath here. So make sure that is always free. Once you're printing, obviously this 100% is the speed of the machine. This is the amount that has been printed and the elapsed time. So if I want to make any changes while printing, press in once, and then I can go down to tune. Into, that is that speed. That was 100% fan speed. We don't have a fan, but it's flow we after. There is a flow 0 and 1. We're working on the first flow. That's the clay print head, and you can go into that flow, and then you can speed it up or lessen it. I have found with my machine, if I turn below 100%, sometimes the screw stops going round for some reason. So I can certainly increase the flow, but I always worry about decreasing the flow. So to get out of that, press in once, and you're back to that level, and up to main, tune, advanced, pause. So obviously you could pause print at any stage if you get into difficulty, or if you have to change the container. I have paused and it will remain, and you can undo the whole container, refill, and then put the container back on. So I'm pressing pause. You can see the nozzle is just lifted away from the print. And press again, and it starts printing. Further down here we have stop and save and stop print. I tend to use stop and save if I'm wanting to ever stop the machine, because if you say stop print, it then says, are you really sure, yes or no, and you have to go through that. With stop and save, I just immediately stops it and moves back up again. So while you're actually printing, as with other machines, if you're in the top layer, the info screen, this speed that the machine is running at, if counterintuitively, if I kind of turn it down, I have to spin it for some while, you can hear the machine is actually speeding up as it's printing. It's clockwise, and it's going down. So again, if I'm getting into trouble with the print, I will lower the speed, try and get the repair sorted, and then go back to full speed. Obviously, any problems while you're going, you just emergency off or switch off there, and you can see the air pressure over here. They're working at about 4 bar. Finally, I just want to go through the slicing settings for the WASP 4100. Obviously, I'm using Cura here, but hopefully what I go through could be translated over into any other slicing program that you might use. So, first of all, you'll need to set up a profile for your printer. So you'll be adding printer, but I already have. So manage and machine settings. So here you can see I've put in the dimensions of the printer, and that's elliptical or round,
and that the origin is at the center and that it's using Marlin G-code flavor. Then the extruder, I've put just a default nozzle of 2. Obviously you could put 4. The nozzle size is not that important. It does have a bit of effect, but later on when you do your settings, you can say, what the width of your nozzle or wall is. But what is important is the compatibility material diameter, and that is, I've put 2 here. What we're doing is tricking this is a software for plastic filament printers, obviously, to thinking what thickness of material is coming in. And because the WASP, this printer's got such a big screw to it, we have to put in quite a big sort of fat material diameter. Otherwise, the screw goes too fast. In other words, if you'd put in a 1 millimeter here, then the screw would go faster, thinking it's got to pump through this thin little filament of material. In the past, I have actually used a 4 millimeter diameter material here for this printer, and then I don't have to slow the flow rate by so much, but we'll get to that in a moment. But anyway, 2 is quite useful, I would suggest, because having set up your printer profile, let's just close that, you then go over to your material profile, and I have created, sort of a profile that I call earth, and then it's called clay, with a diameter of 2 mil. And now within the default sort of plastic options for material, I think there is a 2 millimeter material. So when you, in Cura, make this profile, you should get this populated with some 2 millimeter materials. Whereas if you put in a 4 millimeter material, there are definitely no filaments, well, in the default that are 4 millimeter. And you would then really have to go through kind of making your own material profile. Now, I have another video on YouTube that is about setting up Cura for clay printers, and I go through this whole kind of rigmarole of how to make material profiles in Cura. So it's kind of a little tricky. But anyway, the point here is we're using a 2 millimeter diameter. So we now have a material as well. And so then you'd be building different profiles for the different print styles or nozzles that you might be using. So you can see here on my big WASP, I've got a profile for my 2 millimeter nozzle and then a 4 millimeter nozzle. So just starting with the 2 millimeter, let's go back up to the top. So you can see I'm saying the line width is 2 millimeter, nozzle size. My slice height is 0.9. But then I'm actually building 2 walls next to each other, so sort of I'm making quite sturdy objects with these 2 but thin lines to get good detail. So my wall thickness actually then is double my nozzle, and the clay also spreads a little bit beyond that. So I'm calling my wall thickness of 5, 2 lines to sort of a layer. And then you can see I'm actually printing a bottom layer of 2 layers down there. That'll be a choice of yours as to whether you're printing bases or trying to put a top on it or anything like that. As soon as you are doing bases, then you get a selection of kind of what pattern is being built up there. But under materials, the flow, this is the kind of really important thing that you just got to balance off, and that is, this is related to the amount, the material diameter that has been set up in your machine profile. And with a 2 millimeter diameter, I reduce it to about 40%. Looking back, I see that when I built a 4 millimeter diameter material, I was then running at about 90% flow rate. And if you had like a 1 millimeter filament, then this would be right down at about 10%. So the flow is about slowing the screw down, and if the screw is going too fast, it then tries to force the clay through the nozzle too quickly, and you can start getting this sort of what I call wood graining, a pattern on your print where there's pulsing going on as the clay sort of pulses under pressure through the nozzle. And at extremes, if you're creating too much pressure with the screw, then you can start getting dewatering happening and you get blocking at the entrance to the nozzle. That's on a small nozzle. Obviously, if you're using a big nozzle, it'll just keep going through. So that's the flow rate. Then the speed, with these 2mm nozzle, I'm printing actually pretty fast. Because of my two walls, I'm just trying to get on with the print, and you can see I'm at set everything at 80mm a second. I would suggest start possibly more at 30 or 40mm a second. Otherwise, I'm just scrolling through this so you can see it if you need to reference anything. But I think the only other thing really is the spiralization, that if you're building 2 or more walls, then the spiralize doesn't work. But if we go over to my 4mm nozzle profile, you can see, so there's my line width, that's the nozzle size, so I'd put on the 4mm nozzle. Slice height at 1.3, so my wall thickness a little bit wider than the nozzle because it's spreading out. A line count of 1, I haven't got any base specified here, so you can see that's all become simplified. My material flow rate is the same, although the nozzle is now bigger, the the slicing software will counteract the bigger nozzle and push through enough material when it suspects. Obviously, this could be also varied on the fly. On the LCD screen, you've got the flow rate, so you can change that. And here you can see I've slowed it down at 30mm a second. And then finally, I have tick boxed the spiralized outer contour because I am only doing 1 wall line count, so I know the spiralize would work. Right, I hope that's useful.